Hello everyone. In this tutorial we're going to be talking about primary keys, what they are and how they work, and how to set them up. So every table should have a primary key. Anytime that you create a table, you should always assign a primary key. And the primary key needs to always be a unique value. And in most cases, you generally want your primary key to be an ID, which in this case you can see. So what we're going to do here is we're going to modify or look at the design of this table. And I'm just randomly grabbing this table. All tables will have very similar construction. Now, there are some things in here that I don't agree with. I didn't make this, so please understand that this is not my table. I didn't make this, and so but we're going to use it though just for an example. So one of the things that they did do that I do agree with, that I always do, is I always use an ID as my primary key. And that needs to be a value that has to be unique every time, because that's the identity for this entire table. So each one of these records needs to have a unique identifier. Now, what they've done here to ensure that is that they've said, yes, this is an ID, and we want it to auto increment by 1, and it's going to be a seed. So a seed, like it just says, it starts at 1 and increases every time you add a new record. I believe we went over this before, but not really that in depth. So that being said, the thing that I don't agree with is the data type. Anytime that you have an ID, it should almost always be a big int. And a big int is this. Now, the reason why you want to use a big int, because a small int will run out in a very relatively short period of time. In this particular case, I think a small int only goes up to like maybe 100 or 1,000 or something like that. I'd have to Google it to see how far a small int goes. So basically, you can't add a whole lot of records to this. Now, I assume that that's intentional to force you to update, but you have to consider the human factor when you're building tables. The fact is that humans make mistakes, and that's just a harsh reality that we live in, is that we all make mistakes. And when you limit yourself on tables like this, you could set yourself up potentially for mistakes and failures. So I don't care how big or how small you're expecting the data to be, I always use a big int. Now, a DBA may tell me that I'm wrong, and may correct me in some way, shape, or form, like as to how they view it. From the developer's perspective and a non-DBA's perspective, to keep things simple and make them safe for yourself, I always recommend when you're creating your primary keys to set their data type as a big int. Now, the next thing is, how do you assign something to be a primary key? Like, how do you say this, I want this to be the primary key? Well, what you can do is you can modify this. You can right click and say remove primary key, but we want it back, so then we want to set the primary key. So another thing to keep in mind with a primary key, it cannot be null. You can never allow nulls for a primary key. As it says, the value has to be unique, and the best way to keep it unique is by setting it as an identity and setting it as a seed to auto increment by 1. That way, every time, it will always have a new value every time a new record is created. So that's pretty much how primary keys works. I'm not going to show you how to do it via query. You can create primary keys in queries. Really, the only time that that's ever really useful, unless you're a DBA, is when you're creating a script and honestly, we don't have enough time to go over script creation. That's actually somewhat advanced. Um, Once you get more comfortable with understanding how database structure works and how to actually build databases, I think then that would be a good time to start looking at scripts, and doing some more advanced queries. But for this purpose of this tutorial, just keeping it simple and the fundamentals of primary keys, we will not be going over scripts or script writing for SQL. But that's basically how primary keys work. And you can always depend on a primary key to always select a record based on that value to always guarantee that that record, there's only one of that record. So these values will never be the same, or they should never be the same. They should always be unique. Should never match. And that's done intentionally so you can select that value, and that's because it's a primary key. And as you see in here, it says it uses the abbreviation PK for primary key. And you'll always see primary keys are not null. So we can open every table, and we can see that the primary key will never say null. It always say not null. And it always uses that PK for abbreviation to initialize or to let the user know that, hey, this is a primary key. And Microsoft, in additional, uses this little key icon to let you know it's a primary key. MySQL and Oracle, I think Oracle has like a little key icon as well, but I don't believe MySQL does. It may or may not. I haven't used MySQL in a long time, so that may be a difference.